All right, got a couple people joining. Thanks for joining. We're going to give everyone a second to file in, and we'll get started here shortly. Yeah, a bunch of people filing in already. Great. Okay, Mel, we'll give it one more minute, let people join, and then we'll get started.
All right, sounds good.
All right, why don't we get started? And as people file in, they can, we can always catch them up. But thank you everyone for joining. My name's Rob, I'm with Netcapital. And today we have Mel of Ramp with us doing a live Q&A. So, as a lot of you know, Netcapital is a place where companies can come and raise capital and anyone can invest. And so with that, I'm gonna ask Mel a couple questions today about his company, try and get a better sense of what Ramp does and what the investment opportunity is. And if anyone has questions along the way, please feel free to jump in. There's a Q&A function through Zoom. Ask your questions and I'll slot them in as appropriate throughout today's live Q&A. So with that, Mel, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great. So just kicking it off, can you give us just a brief overview of what Ramp is and what you guys do?
Yeah, so Ramp's mission is to cure disability using robotics. Today, we're building the world's lightest and fastest electric wheelchair. And tomorrow, we're building exoskeletons to make wheelchairs obsolete. So our first product is in the electric wheelchair space. Electric wheelchairs typically weigh 300 to 400 pounds. We create a retrofit for manual wheelchairs that turns them into a sub 30 pounds electric vehicle that can go off-road.
Very cool. And so before we dive too much into the actual company, can you just talk to me about yourself, you and your team and what your guys' backgrounds are and how you kind of got to where you are?
Yeah, so I guess I'll kind of circle around the whole team and then
sure.
End with me and my story. So right now we're focusing on products. We have 3 full-time engineers. We recruited Mitch, our first hire, from Formula SAE. This is where students design a Formula race car from scratch in 1 semester, build it from scratch in a 2nd semester, and then race it against other collegiate teams. Amro, my co-founder, is our mechatronics engineer. So he programs the control systems for the motors and motor controllers and the self-balancing algorithms for the 9-axis IMU that has 3 accelerometers, 3 gyroscopes, 3 magnetometers to deal with. Our 2 main advisors are Yannick Roux, who's a former manufacturing engineering director at Tesla, and Todd Hargroder, who recently sold ADI Rides, his wheelchair backrest company, to Pride Mobility, which is one of the largest wheelchair companies in the world. And then we have Will Russell, marketing consultant firm, because we're doing a pre-sale campaign in the spring, which I'll talk more about later. But he's done dozens of pre-sale campaigns, all of them raising a couple $100,000 in pre-sales, if not well over $1 million. And then I myself as CEO work on fundraising and biz dev, obviously, but I'm also the mechanical design lead. So my background is basically at 18, I designed spacewalk tools for NASA as the youngest team lead in that research program. Later designed 3D biometric fingerprint and iris scanners for a DOJ subcontractor. And I've always just kind of had this love of hardware, and I was building up all this hardware experience, but it was kind of with a purpose, because I started this company because I broke my back at 14 in a motorcycle accident. And ever since that day, I've known my life's purpose was to start a wheelchair company, because everything I saw had been designed in the 80s.
Yeah, and an amazing story. It sounds like you've put a great team together, and I think that blends perfectly into my next question. Is kind of talk to us about the problem you're looking to solve.
Yeah, so it's kind of twofold. There's the problem itself, and there's the solutions that are out there today. So basically, obviously, there are huge mobility challenges in a wheelchair having to do with surfaces, grass, gravel, snow. Inclines are a really big one, and then of course obstacles like curbs. And so basically, when you're in a wheelchair, kind of your world is limited to perfectly flat surfaces. And as I always joke about, the world isn't flat no matter what the internet tells you. And you kind of have the option of, okay, well, you can stay only on flat surfaces, or you can really destroy your shoulders if you are able to get over the obstacles yourself, or have a caretaker, who I've been told also caretakers also get tired, or you can kind of redesign the wheelchair. So the problem today is basically the incentive structure. So all of the incumbents, they're wheelchair manufacturers that sell through distributors, basically reimbursed by Medicare and insurance companies. Now, these are HCPCS billing codes, so the revenue per unit is completely fixed, and therefore there's not really any incentive to have a new product offering, because essentially they'll kind of lose their economy of scale with their existing product line, and they're still going to get the same amount of reimbursement. So the incentives are only really there for new companies. And actually there's an interesting dynamic there, because none of the incumbents have R&D departments, R&D budgets, engineers. And basically all they do is exclusively acquire smaller startups.
That's interesting. So you're saying the kind of incumbents in the space right now, and it makes sense. You look at people who use electric wheelchairs, and they tend to be very big and bulky, and you're saying that it's because they're basically not doing R&D.
Yeah, I mean, they have no incentive to. Basically what will happen is, a small startup will have some cool technology, and then they'll be a little interested in for that, and then that'll start to take up some of their market share, and then they'll acquire them. And that's basically their model for new product lines.
Interesting. So on that note, why don't you tell us a little bit about your actual product and product line? What are you doing to kind of revolutionize the space?
So it's basically a 15-pound retrofit that attaches to any manual wheelchair to convert them into an electric vehicle, and it can self-balance. Let's see, I can't really do the demo on here, but basically when you wheelie a chair, you lift the front wheels up off the ground. And so now you only have your large 26-inch tires touching the ground, and you have like a foot of ground clearance. So in theory, if you have this self-balancing going on, then anyone can get in this chair and get over pretty much any obstacle. It also, our unlimited version right now goes about 14 miles an hour. The FDA version will be limited to 6 miles an hour. And basically this is, I mean, it's an order of magnitude lighter than anything else people are really using. If you look at our competitors, there's, let's see, there's the eMotion, which weighs 100 pounds. So you end up with like 120 pounds wheelchair at the end of the day. And it was designed by Yamaha in the 80s. and they haven't really changed that much. There's the Smart Drive, which is it's newer. It's kind of in the past decade, and it's pretty light. It's 12.5 pounds. The problem is they hang it off the back of the chair. So from a vehicle dynamics perspective, all of your weight and all of your surface area is on your big 26-inch wheels. You're hanging off something off the back, and it basically has no traction. Like, you have the slightest problem and it's just going to spin itself out, and you have zero ground clearance. So like, if there's a rock, if there's a puddle, it's just like in that.
That makes sense. Just so for people watching, there's a great video on Ramp's page on Netcapital that includes a pitch, and you can see some of their chair in action if you want to check it out there. And what's the range on your current model at 14 miles an hour?
First, I just want to say that, yeah, the video is really great. We have the self-balancing algorithm where you can see it wheeling over obstacles and going off-road, and how portable it is, like putting it in a car. I've taken it on ride shares, Ubers, planes, whatever. As far as range, so it's actually modular. So today, the electric wheelchairs on the market, including our competitors, which are e-assist that attach to an existing manual chair, all of them have fixed batteries. So if you run out of battery, you're stranded, and you need to call someone with a hydraulic lift on like a mobility van to come pick you up. And I've seen that happen many times. What we have is a hot swappable battery, so that you can basically, instead of waiting hours to recharge, you just take a couple seconds to swap out the battery. And that also means you can choose the battery size. So we have like a 2-pound battery. Kind of a general rule of thumb, so it's like a battery weighs a couple pounds. It's like a 40 watt-hour battery. It has a range of like 2 miles. So, you know, that's more than an average person walks a day. So that's fine for most applications. And then I'll have like a 10-pound battery, 300 watt-hours. That's the most you can take on a plane. And that has a 15-mile range if you're really like using this to basically commute to and from work.
Interesting. And if you do use it to commute to and from work, can you like if you sit at your desk, can you like plug it into the wall and recharge? Is that how it works?
I guess if you have a charger, that's something we have thought about. Yeah. I think the bigger thing is more the hot swappable. So like ideally you'd have like a battery charger under your desk, and you'd have like a spare battery there. I would probably keep a bunch in my car. And so that way you don't even have to really worry about charging. You just swap one out for the other.
That makes sense. So, you know, especially for people who aren't as kind of up to speed on this industry and this space, you know, how big is the market for wheelchairs and electric wheelchairs in the US or beyond?
So in the US alone, it's a $2 billion a year market with pretty insane growth, like 18% compound annual growth. And the reasons for that are kind of obvious. I mean, if you look at anything with wheels today, they're becoming electrified. And so that's the fast growing segment. And then there's the $1 billion a year US market for manual wheelchairs, kind of in both of those. Kind of the biggest trend for us, and specifically for between 2020 and 2030, is there's going to be more aging of the US population than any time before. So today you have 10,000 people a day reaching the age 65, retirement age. And obviously with economic development, you have a slowdown of the birth rate. So basically in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to have this issue where there's just not going to be enough young people to push around old people in wheelchairs anymore. That's kind of the caretaking model in the past. It's going to have to be electric wheelchairs. and people are living longer, they're living more active lives. So in the next 10 years, this market is really going to explode and actually cause a huge load on our healthcare system.
Interesting. So quick note, for everyone, I think a couple people just joined us. If anyone has questions, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A below and we'll get them asked. So Mel, when you think about your product now, given kind of the size dynamics and the weight dynamics and cost, do you think this is something where eventually almost no one who's in a wheelchair will use manual wheelchairs and basically everyone will have kind of a little motor attached, or will it still be for people kind of living with disability, will they also have their manual wheelchair and just the ramp wheelchair will be the one that they use when they want to use an electric wheelchair? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say definitely for sure. I mean, you can kind of look at what's happened with e-bikes. Depending on the market, like in some areas, 60% of bicycles are electric. But yeah, I would say honestly, in the future, I think everything with wheels will have a little motor attached.
That's fair. You're right that we're just seeing more and more vehicles go electric. Can you talk to me a little bit about the business model of Ramp? How do you guys plan to make money? How do you plan to sell?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of your typical one-off hardware sale. What's really nice is that in our industry, typically you have 85-90% gross margins. I guess, yeah, kind of just in the medical device space, even though what we're building as far as our bill of materials is pretty simple. It's motors, it's batteries, it's motherboards for the controllers. So we're in a very high margin market, and basically the first thing we're doing is in the spring, we're going to do a pre-sale campaign, and we've partnered with a YouTuber who has 5 million subscribers, and his videos, just the ones specifically about off-road electric wheelchairs, just specifically that, those videos have gotten between 1 and 14 million views on YouTube, and then even a little more than that when they're posted on Facebook. So that's our pre-sale campaign that we're going to launch in the spring, and it's going to be two things. So it'll be people who want to buy it for themselves can purchase it for themselves, and then there's also going to be we're basically going to have a campaign to people can contribute to the crowd sale funds by basically donating it for it to be donated to a disabled veteran. And there's that I think we're going to have much better conversion rates on our click through the YouTube videos, because obviously not every YouTube video viewer is in a wheelchair, but every YouTube viewer potentially would donate. And kind of a nice figure for that is about $2.5 billion each year donated just for veteran services. So I don't think we'll have a problem at all with that. And actually we found a lot of our competitors, because it's such a high price point item, like a $5,000 to $10,000 item that an individual usually can't afford. A large part of the market is organizations like these disabled veterans, nonprofits buying them for veterans. So that's our kind of initial push. And then after that, we're going to get an FDA 510K clearance, which is actually pretty straightforward. It's known as a pre-market notification, and it's basically saying, hey, these are basically electric wheelchairs. Here are some electric wheelchairs that there have been in the past. This meets the same quality standards. And then they push it through based on precedent, basically. And with that 510K, you can get reimbursement. For that HCPCS billing code, that's $7,300 of reimbursement. And that's what we think we need to scale.
So the plan is to kind of do a twofold sales strategy of going direct to consumer to start, but also making sure you can get health insurance reimbursement as well.
Right. And for both of those, initially, we're going to stick with that price point, which is about $7,000. I think on the direct to consumer side, we're definitely going to go cheaper because there isn't as much FDA paperwork, obviously.
Yeah.
But one thing we're interested in the future is kind of obviously we have a lot of healthcare infrastructure problems in this country. But you also see electric vehicles are getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. I think the future of healthcare in general will be direct care, where you take your 20% copay, and 20% of $7,000 is a lot. That's like $1,500. If in the future we would like to create a vehicle that's about $1,500, and then you have a system where it's actually the same, more cheaper than just paying your copay, even if you do have good insurance.
Mm-hmm.
And instead of waiting months, you wait days. You kind of get all the customization you want, and on top of that, you're not putting as much load on the healthcare system in the first place. So I think the future is direct care, and there's no reason we can't sell way more of these in a way bigger market for basically the price of the copay.
Very interesting. So we've got the first kind of question from the audience here. The question is, in your initial plan on the Netcapital page, you plan to launch in August, and what attributed to the setback to the kind of spring of 2020 to do the first launch of the product?
Right. So we were kind of initially going to do a smaller rollout. The plan was to basically fund our product development by selling beta testing units. I kind of will talk more about the Teal Fellowship, but basically has extended the time pressure side of things, where we can focus more on the product. And so basically we're not doing any sales for the beta testing units. We've just been doing the beta testing in-house or testing with people, but without selling it. The other thing is that basically we decided to move up our timelines for the other features. So to talk about those, one of them is push assist. So initially we were going to launch without that. We kind of decided we wanted to launch with all of the best features. So push assist is where you have sensors on the push rim, and basically instead of feeling like you're riding something, it feels like you're stronger all of a sudden, which is kind of the hallmark of push assist on bicycles. And that definitely takes a lot longer. And we also did discover that that's much more favorable for billing codes. If you have push assist versus a joystick, you have almost 3 times as much reimbursement. So there's definitely some lessons learned the hard way there, where we realized we really did need to launch with these features that we thought would be later stage. Another one is torque. So our demo day, I guess we would call it a proof of concept, that self-balancing, and you can see it going up hills in Boulder and going off-road. That had about 15 Newton meters of torque. We've since on our most recent iteration, we've 8x'd that torque. We now have 100 Newton meters, and that probably doesn't mean anything to you. It's just kind of a number, but for context, your average internal combustion engine car has about 200 Newton meters. So Yeah, we have quite a lot more torque than we had before. We're basically launching what we thought was going to be our second gen product.
Great. So basically the reason why you pushed is you've got a little capital, you're not in a rush to sell, and you're improving the product over the next kind of 6 months to come to market directly with a larger scale, more advanced product.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, and then there's also, you know, candidly, we did learn more about the insurance billing structure and the features that you would really want to launch with. You know, I would say, you know, we're getting 3 times the reimbursement. We're not necessarily doing 3 times the amount of work. We are having to do a lot more work, but it's definitely worth it for that difference in billing.
That makes sense. Another question from the audience is, have you started conversations with insurance companies, and how are those conversations going? If you can provide any update on that.
So fortunately, we don't have to do that. That would kind of be a nightmare. So I guess what you would be talking about is if you're making a new billing code. We're under an existing HCPCS billing code. That's just $7,300, and it's a push assist for manual wheelchairs, and it has to have the push rim assist. And basically, so we have to get a FDA 510K clearance. That's not an FDA approval. That's just a clearance. That should cost $50 to $75K. It should take 3 to 6 months. And the other thing you need is to actually be assigned that HCPCS billing code. That doesn't cost nearly as much, but it'll probably, again, take 3 to 6 months. And you can do this, both of them in parallel. Once you have those 2 things, then basically the patient gets a something called a seating clinic, which is the process where they get like the prescription and the letter of medical necessity. And basically all we have to do is we go to the biggest conference of each year, the International Seating Symposium, where basically each one of the 200 rehab hospitals in the US, all of them will have a representative there. So basically all the therapists will know about our product. And once they prescribe it, then all that has to happen is basically the claim just has to be filed. Unfortunately, that's kind of not a super fun process. We don't deal with that. We just run it through a claims clearinghouse. But basically, once we have, I'll try to be more concise. Once we have the FDA 510K clearance, and once we've been assigned a HCPCS code, all that has to be done is that the insurance claim just has to be filed. All of the, you know, whether it's not going to be reimbursed or all of that is already in the books.
Great. And do you have a timeline on when you think you want to get that 510 clearance done?
We'll start the process sometime next year. There's quite a large market for just directly buying things like this, especially if it's something like ours where you can use it for recreation, or you can use it to commute to work. So we're pretty confident that we can get enough sales without the reimbursement, and this is really kind of the scaling move. The plan would be sometime in 2021 to have the 510K clearance, the HCPCS codes, and then start pushing the reimbursement side of things.
Great. We have more questions coming in. Another one was, can you talk about your burn rate and how much of it is salaries?
Yeah, so with the Teal Fellowship, it's kind of hard to figure. So our burn rate right now is nominally about $10K a month. And that's going to basically one engineer's salary, and the rest is going to non-recurring engineering costs, so like machining, prototyping, stuff like that. And then there's, you know, of course, the office and all of that, but we have very small overhead. Right now, myself and my co-founder, we actually aren't taking salaries. We're using the Teal Fellowship, which is a non-diluting grant that's paid directly to us. So that, I guess, if you were to factor that in, let's see, if you were to like amortize it, yeah, it'd be more like 17K net burn, something like that.
Well, and maybe now is a good time for you to explain to us what the Teal Fellowship is and kind of why it's a big deal and how it's helped the company get to where it is.
Yeah, so it's super interesting. So I'm a very young founder. I just turned 23, and basically I studied mechanical engineering for 3 years on a full ride, and I dropped out to start a company. And at first glance, that might not seem like the greatest idea, but Peter Thiel, who, if you haven't heard of him, he's very famous in the Silicon Valley, but he's the billionaire co-founder of PayPal. And despite having a law degree from Stanford Law, he believes, I think for good reason, that US education is kind of a bubble. You've got decreasing value of degrees, but increasing costs of degrees. So each year, 20 students are chosen to be paid $100,000 to drop out of school. There are 6,000 applicants each year. So yeah, there's a 1/3 of 1% acceptance rate. Very grateful to be accepted. And yeah, I've talked to these amazing founders. Basically, yeah, if you're not under 23, if you haven't kind of dropped out, started a company, raised at least $100K in venture capital, they probably won't even interview you. And I think my favorite thing about it is because it's a non-diluting grant, not only are you not giving up the equity that you would normally give up for that type of funding, but also they're much less risk averse. They're not just investing in B2B SaaS. They have a ton of healthcare, hardware, robotics founders, much more than you would see in the average portfolio. And so my network, especially in the Bay Area now with healthcare, robotics, hardware, is really amazing. And I've gotten to talk to these super young founders who are doing amazing things in healthcare.
That's great. And you know, the other program that you talk about being a part of, and maybe this is a good time to chat about that as well, is Techstars. So can you tell us a little bit about what that program is, how you got in, and kind of what the result of that's been?
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, both were actually this year. Techstars was a little earlier. So Techstars, for those of you who don't know, is a startup accelerator. They invest $80 million a year into 400 companies in over 40 countries. And each one is basically each program in its city. Ours was in Boulder, which was the original program where Techstars was founded and is headquartered. They choose 10 companies out of about 1,000. Each one is funded with $120K, and you're given 3 months of training because they've kind of seen and been able to generalize the things most likely to cause a startup to fail. And then, of course, they go over fundraising and business development and marketing and all of that. It's basically a 3-month startup boot camp with funding, and then it kind of culminates in a demo day and follow-on investment. So Techstars has been an amazing program. For those of you that don't know, it's definitely one of the best things you can do for an early stage startup, especially to de-risk it.
Great, and we've got another question from the from the audience here. One is, have you lined up manufacturers? And if so, who/where will that happen?
So because it's a high margin, high price point, and low volume product, medical devices are actually typically manufactured in the US. And that even helps with some of the quality control stuff. But basically, we've been using local manufacturers. So we have one in Boulder that actually about 40% of their manufacturing volume is just medical devices. And yeah, there's that. On basically everything we produce in-house is mechanical. So that's all machines produced in the US, and all of that makes sense to have in the US. And then the motors, the batteries, the motherboards, the controllers, all of that is already manufactured at scale in China, where obviously it makes sense to manufacture. And we are using off-the-shelf power electronics. That's a huge de-risking factor for us. Is basically all of our IP is naturally the relationship between the motors and the wheels, and how those motherboards are programmed, how the control software is programmed. And for a idea, kind of some rough numbers. So for a $5,000 product sold direct to consumer, each $1 million in revenue is then just 200 units. So we're talking about really low volume. But the price breaks are really good, because for machining, well, I don't have good enough numbers to share on the machining, but on the, let's say the electronic side, we have 20% price breaks at each of these numbers. So for ordering just 25 units of these motors or the controller, pretty much all of them have the same unit economics. If we order 25 of them, there's a 20% price break, which is basically just for that's just a price break for just shipping them all in one pallet, basically. And then the next is about 100, 200, 500. Each of those has 20% price breaks, which is pretty crazy. So yeah, but basically doing everything local that we can, because it makes sense, especially for medical devices. And then the really difficult stuff is already at scale, and it has great price breaks.
Great. Just a reminder again, great questions so far from everyone listening in. I'm coming to the last couple of my questions. And so if anyone has any last minute questions, please feel free to throw them in. So, the next question on my list is, without getting too speculative, and this also is a question that was asked by the crowd is, so what was asked from one of our attendees is, Ramp is a big acquisition target for some of the 1980s companies you mentioned. As soon as they notice kind of what is your vision for the company? And on top of that, what I would ask is, what do you see as kind of the long-term vision for the company, and what do you see as a potential exit for the company?
So kind of, as I spoke about before with the incentive structures for the incumbents, they don't spend money on R&D. They don't have R&D budgets. They do have rather large acquisition budgets. A very large portion of their spend is just for acquisitions. And kind of the obvious one would be Permobil. Pretty much every major product in the space has been acquired by them. They're about $1 billion company, and they're the oldest and largest wheelchair manufacturer in the world. That would make a lot of sense for them. It would make a lot of sense for us, especially because we really only want to sell in kind of the US and Canada, and a little bit in Europe. But they sell all over the world, which is obviously a much bigger task. So they would make sense. You've seen Toyota is pretty big in the mobility space. We're going to be looking into actually in the spring, which is pretty good timing for us. They actually have $1 million non-diluting grant specifically for wheelchair innovations. So the Toyota Mobility Foundation, just Toyota as a company, has a lot of interest in the space. Yamaha historically has worked on some of these systems since the 80s. Yamaha Motors Ventures is something we're looking at. They only do Series A, so they're kind of later stage, but Yamaha they have a very specific thesis on electric mobility, on portable mobility, so they would be a good fit. I would say overall, Permobil is the obvious one. They spend a ton of money on acquisitions. They don't have an R&D budget. They just have an acquisition budget. But my personal dream would be for kind of a purely mobility company like Toyota or Yamaha. Those are the two that have they're like explicitly in the space. Obviously any company like Honda, Ford, they're all getting into electric vehicles and especially, I guess, what you would call micro mobility today. That's kind of everything on their side. On our side, the vision is basically going back to our mission of curing disability using robotics. Our product roadmap is first, we're just doing the one component that makes the biggest impact, which is the drive system, where we can kind of reduce 90% of the weight and increase the capabilities of the disabled users. And then of course we'll create an entire wheelchair. The unit economics for those are really good. I mean, we're talking about 90% plus margins. Again, the billing codes drive kind of the whole industry, but basically think about, okay, well, in our space, these manual titanium wheelchairs, these are selling for $3,000 to $5,000. For $5,000 to $7,500, well, like really $5,000 to $10,000 for electric assist. And a lot of the time insurance is just paying for those because both of those combined is still cheaper than buying an electric wheelchair. So I think like a group 1, group 2 electric wheelchair is like around $10,000. And then going up from there, complex rehab, those will go anywhere from $20,000 to $50,000. And they're not really, more expensive to make. They just kind of have require more understanding on the clinical side. But basically, if you create the entire wheelchair, the entire electric wheelchair, on the billing side, the margins are better, the revenue's higher. We're talking about, tens of thousands of dollars per unit.
Yeah.
And then moving on from there, we'll create a standing wheelchair. The philosophy about that on my side is, when you're in a wheelchair, getting around is a huge obstacle, and being able to interact with the world that's designed for people who are standing. So if you can go anywhere, which you can on our current wheelchair, and then if you can stand on our future wheelchair, then you've kind of solved 90% of the problems associated with the disability. On the insurance side, there's quite a lot of reimbursement for standing wheelchairs. And there's also kind of good health incentives there because obviously insurance doesn't want to pay for surgeries or hospitalizations. And sitting, studies have kind of come out over the past decade that have shown sitting is the new smoking. So the cardiovascular implications of a standing frame are very favorable. And so kind of those are the reasons I want to build one, but also that the economics are good. And so our product roadmap will then go from wheelchair retrofit to full wheelchair to standing frame wheelchair. And you can kind of see where this is going, where now we're just basically building a an exoskeleton on wheels, and then we'll just transition to a full exoskeleton. So the product roadmap is, I mean, as straightforward as exoskeletons could be on the engineering side, and on the billing side, there's a lot. And then that obviously opens up applications for, now it's not just for disabled people. This can actually augment able-bodied people, and really open up the market.
That's great. I think you had one question come in while you were talking about that, is what are the major challenges you're working on in the next 1 to 2 years? And you might have just answered it with, you're talking about your product roadmap, but if you have any other things to expound on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I guess just to summarize, we're focusing on the product right now. We've basically focused on performance, and then next we're focusing on safety, and then in the spring we're going to do pre-sales, which we plan on delivering probably Q1 2021. That's strategic because we don't want anyone kind of being upset that they don't get it right before Christmas or anything. And that basically gives us a pretty good timeline for being able to deliver on those pre-sales, getting the production run up, and we can do that because it's low volume production in the US, in the hundreds of units, not in the thousands. And that would be our first $1 million or $2 million in revenue. Once we get to that point, then we're going to go into the FDA 510K clearance, the HCPCS billing code for the $7,300 billing code for each unit, and then kind of scaling that out probably more in 2021. And one of the bridges there, which I didn't mention, was so obviously we have a very kind of more modern e-commerce driven marketing plan than most wheelchair companies, which basically do everything through sales reps. The problem with that is obviously not everyone clicking through an ad is in a wheelchair. So the conversion rates really depend on us being able to have them as donations for disabled veterans, which again that alone is like a $2.5 billion market. So just for our first couple million in revenue, that is definitely, I think definitely going to be good. But what's further than that is I've talked a little bit about how kind of insurance companies do things. That's all based on, I've basically been talking about how Medicare does things, and therefore everybody else follows Medicare as those guidelines. And I mean, the unit economics are good, but it's kind of better if you can avoid the insurance companies altogether. So the way we're doing that, obviously we're going direct to consumer first. But the other thing is that with all these disabled veterans, I mean, that's a cause that's really important to me, but it's also strategic because this is a large market that people donate money in. There are federal grants for these things. There's all of that. But more importantly, there's the VA. And the VA has way less regulatory overhead than Medicare. Like you think about all the things that are wrong with Medicare. I mean, the VA has a lot of problems, but it does not have nearly as much paperwork. And that results in, so basically that's a strategic in the sense that we want that to be the bridge where first we sell direct to consumer and people will be donating money to have these donated to disabled veterans. But that's kind of one of the biggest drivers of the VA. Like, for instance, the VA has billing codes for iPads because they had people on VA disability like buying iPads and getting some kind of VA reimbursement for them because there was some kind of clinical value to them. And then as a result of that widespread use, they made a billing code for iPads. So that's kind of the strategy they're moving from direct to consumer to reimbursed by payers, not necessarily insurance companies, but VA, the like, workers' comp.
Great. Got a couple more questions here for you. One was, would you consider not exiting and instead grow the business and conquer new markets? That is, turn Ramp into the next big global mobility company. I think that's referring back to your talk about Yamaha and Toyota.
Yeah, that definitely goes through my mind with, so like Permobil is kind of the obvious acquisition. I mean, I've talked to founders who have exited through that. The problem I have with them is they're really good at selling the product. They'd be really good at selling it overseas. But again, like once they acquire the startup, R&D at the startup ends as well. Not a big fan of that. So conquering Permobil, yeah, absolutely. Competing with Permobil and becoming kind of the next billion-dollar wheelchair company, definitely have an interest in that. To be honest, as far as exiting with a larger company like Toyota or Yamaha, I'd probably be much more interested, like kind of philosophically, on that side, and especially the innovation that they could bring, because obviously they don't stop R&D at their acquisitions. They fund it.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the last one would be like an IPO, right? That's something I have thought about, because I think with the social mission, it could be a really great thing. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't thought too much about turning down acquisitions, to be honest.
That's a fair place to be, and you guys are early on. Great. So this is less a question, more a comment, but someone did comment. Wow, Mel, your story is so amazing, inspiring. Invested as soon as I heard. So good luck and best wishes.
Oh,
so
thank you so much.
Supporters out there.
That's great.
So much appreciated, and thanks everyone for joining. So that's all the questions we have for now. If anyone has some last minute questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A below. But otherwise, Mel, as we wrap up here, anything else you'd like potential investors to know, as you kind of wrap up the chat here?
I think I'd kind of just like to go back to my story. Disability is something that kind of affects the families of many people. Certainly everyone knows someone who's been affected by this. So, maybe you're not in the position to invest right now, but I can guarantee you know someone who would be interested. And I would just really, really appreciate it and really implore you to share this with anyone who you think would care about this mission. Or maybe someone who just really likes mechanical things or electric mobility, which is fast growing, and would like to invest in that.
Great. Well, Mel, thanks for taking some time out of your day and building your product to come and chat with us. Much appreciated. Thanks everyone who sat in and joined and asked some really great questions. If anyone's interested in learning more about Ramp or investing, they can go to netcapital.com and find Ramp's offering page there. They're open for investing. If anyone has any other questions of Mel, there's a discussion board on their page that you can type questions into. If anyone has questions about Netcapital or how to invest, you can reach out to us directly at hello@netcapital.com. You can email me directly. My email address is in the invite to this webinar. And obviously you can go on our website, netcapital.com, and there should be a chat out there as well. So one final time, Mel, thanks for taking the time to be with us. Thanks everyone for joining.
Yeah, thanks for watching everyone. And thanks Rob for setting this up.
Of course. Have a good day, everybody.